Okay, great. Thank you. I was going to say ladies and gentlemen, but it's just ladies. So thank you very much for coming today for Bright Blue's oral evidence session, which is part of our Conservatism and Human Rights project, which is a year-long project. And we're doing numerous things, including this oral evidence session, which will feed into a final report from our commission, which the people who are sitting on the commission include Maria Miller, who is the chair of the House of Commons Women Equality Select Committee. We also have Dominic Grieve, who's coming to a later session. He is chair of the Intelligence Select Committee. Caroline Spellman, who is second State Church Commissioner. And we also have Lord Daniel Finkelstein, Matthew Tancona, and Benedict Rogers. They're all coming to different sessions throughout the day. And Maria, as you know, is very much interested in the gender issue. So what we're going to do is we'll just go straight into questions, and just to say that it's being filmed and it's also being live tweeted. Your evidence will probably be transcribed and used in the final report, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you endorse all of our report's recommendations at the end of the project, and we make that clear in the report. So who's questioning you today? We have James Dobson, who's a researcher at Bright Blue, myself, Ryan, the director, Maria, and Nigel Fletcher, who's our head of research. If we could start just by introducing ourselves, so we'll start with Polly.
So I'm Polly Neate. I'm the Chief Executive of Women's Aid, which is a national domestic abuse charity, and we're a federation of over 220 local grassroots domestic abuse organisations. We also campaign and lobby and work closely with government on all issues relating to domestic abuse.
My name is Sarah Churchman. I'm HR Director with a professional services firm called PwC, and I lead on talent management, diversity and inclusion and employee wellbeing there in the UK and also globally.
I'm Jessica Asato. I'm the Public Affairs Manager at Safe Lives, which is also a national charity for domestic abuse. We combine data, research and insight to find out what really works to make victims safe.
And I'm Smethers, Chief Executive of the Fawcett Society, and we're a charity campaigning for women's rights and gender equality and marking 150 years of the organisation this year.
Great. I'm going to start with you, Sam. So the first question I have is, looking over the past decade, what do you think the biggest triumphs have been for women and women's progress? And what do you think have been the biggest challenges which we still need to do some work on?
Okay, in terms of progress, I think there are a couple of key things I would point to. One is, certainly in terms of, if you look at employment rates, we've got more women and more mothers in the workforce than ever before, so that's been increasing and improving. But the downside to that is some of the quality of the work that they're doing isn't so great, and the security of those jobs isn't so great. So we've got more in work, but actually how good is the work that they're able to do is the sort of rider to that. I think the second area of progress has been the Equality Act and also the implementation of the gender pay gap reporting requirements that we've seen, the Labour government put in place, the coalition government implement, and now it's actually rolled out the regulations, which we're expecting to see, although we haven't seen them yet, before Christmas. And I think another couple of other key areas of progress have been on extending the right to request flexible working to everyone. That was something certainly that we campaigned for the EOC when I was there 10 years ago, and it seemed quite radical at the time, and now that has been implemented. I think progress on shared parental leave has been significant, although not as radical as we would have wanted, but that's again recognising that we support and enable men to spend time caring for children. So in terms of sort of workplace, for women, I think there's a number of sort of areas of progress really.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Sarah, Sam mentioned the gender pay gap and the ongoing issue around that. I mean, what do you think are the root causes of that? Why are employers differentiating the rate that they pay women who are at the same level as men?
Well, I suppose I'd question if that is indeed the case, because certainly we have been reporting our gender pay gap for the last 3 years, and our analysis shows the key driver of the gap is the underrepresentation of women at the top of the organisation. So we've been working hard to bring more women through to senior roles. Ironically, sometimes when you're achieving on that, your gap gets worse because women are entering more senior roles but at the bottom of the pay rung for that grade, if you see what I mean. So I think the gender pay gap, I think the requirement to report is very helpful. I think it is just one data point though that helps organisations to better understand the depth and breadth of their gender equality challenges.
Maria, did you have some questions?
Yes. Sam, you talked about the triumphs that in response to Ryan's question. I think that's good to recognise. But in reading through the evidence from you and from other individuals who've put things forward, it's clear to me there are things that need to be done. You mentioned shared parental leave, and then Sarah mentioned the issue of promoting women to more senior positions. Given that it's so clear what we need to do, why aren't we seeing the radical approach that you perhaps hinted you might want to see?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, one of the big challenges, I think there are three sort of barriers, if you like. One's attitudinal barriers, so the sort of hidden attitudes that drive our behaviours and our choices and the way in which we respond to women and men in the workplace, for example. I think there are structural barriers, so the way we design the labour market and the way we design work, and I think that prevents progress. And I think then there are practice barriers, so the way employers behave in their recruitment practices, promotion practices and so on. So I think all of those things combine to make it difficult to achieve progress. So the question is to what extent government can intervene to speed up progress and speed up change. And one of the things I think we would want to see government do, certainly in terms of implementing this gender pay gap regulation, do it as quickly as possible, but also require employers to have an action plan in place to address the pay gap. On shared parental leave, go further than that and have move towards an equalisation of leave entitlements. So you start from a presumption of equality, not a presumption of mothers doing all the caring, and then you're just sort of deviating from that norm. And then similarly on flexible working, you start from the assumption that every job will be advertised on a flexible working basis, not that the norm is an inflexible norm that you're then deviating from. So if you change your starting point, I think a lot of this stuff is about where you start from, then you will see a faster pace of progress towards equality and will help to close the pay gap more quickly.
Sarah, I mean, I just want to bring you in here. Given that there's a clear law in place that employers have to follow to treat women equally to men, why aren't they?
Well, I think that's an interesting statement because I think this is not about treating people equally or the same. I think it's about recognising that men and women are quite different and might need different kinds of treatment. And I think part of the reason why we are where we are is because many people have equated fairness as treating everybody the same, but actually what we're talking about is equality of outcomes. So I think that's been the biggest realisation for organisations, particularly large ones like mine, which is to say we may need to treat people very differently in order to deliver equality of outcomes. That said, I think a lot of the inequality in the workplace is driven by inequality in society. And Sam mentioned attitudinal barriers. I think that's a huge one that's very difficult to legislate against. But I think as long as we have very, very strong social stereotypes about what men should do and what women should do, I think we're going to struggle to deliver equality in the workplace. What we have had in my organisation is a fantastic take-up of shared parental leave. We've gone the extra mile saying to our dads or same-sex partners that, if you take your leave in the first 22 weeks when we would ordinarily pay a mother full-time, we will pay you full pay rather. And that's really helped us to deliver over 100 men now on shared parental leave at PwC. And I think the more we make things like childcare less of a women's issue, the easier it is in the workplace. But that, society has to change their view about who should be the primary carer, if indeed there should be a primary carer. But I think the attitudinal barriers are really difficult to legislate against. A lot of organisations are investing in unconscious bias awareness training. I've long since said unconscious bias awareness training isn't the panacea either. It's helpful in supporting people to understand that very point, that you may need to treat people differently to deliver equality of outcomes.
And I mean, the problem with these sorts of sessions is we always have the people who are willing to give evidence, and PwC obviously is well known for its extremely good employment practices. But, there is a legal, and so I'm probably asking you to think outside of your own organisation responding to this. And there is a legal obligation to treat people the same, whether that's about, outcomes or the treatment in itself. It's not an optional extra. Yet businesses' approach still seems to be that it is an optional extra. How do we crack that? And does Brexit offer us some opportunities where presumably the demand for more labour is going to mean that people have got to think more creatively?
I think we do need to think more creatively. Sam also mentioned about our structures at work and the ways in which we work, and I think we are in the 21st century but still working very much in a 20th century working pattern. I think technology offers a huge opportunity for organisations to transform, and I think the need to focus on regional employment as well, not just it all being taking place in the southeast, offers huge opportunity for work to become much more flexible, not just in terms of times, but where work gets done. So I think that's a great opportunity to further this agenda. And I think you're right. I mean, I don't think organisations are deliberately, sizable organisations. I think there's a whole raft of organisations in terms of size. But I think for bigger organisations, they don't intend not to prioritise this. But I think ways in which work has often been or always been done does tend to get in the way, and it does require a bit of a rethink, and it requires investment as well in things like technology.
So Sam, 20th century working in 21st century Britain, that's not good news.
It's not good news, and I think there are a couple of things I would say about poor practice and the way the law does and doesn't protect individual women, and how and what that means for what employers need to think about it. So, if you think about maternity discrimination, for example, which we know to be a massive issue, your committee's done a great deal of work on this, only a tiny fraction of women who experience that will challenge it. So it's incredibly difficult for an individual woman to bring a claim because employment tribunal fees, the time limit, and so on. You just had a baby. How many women have just had a baby want to challenge something like that? So the whole system works against the individual challenging. In the meantime, the people who have been perpetuating that practice are still in that workplace and can do it again potentially. There's nothing to stop that happening again. And so I think one of the big challenges that employers face is how do you deal with poor practice within your own organisation when it is identified, when you can see it happening, when it becomes visible to you? And is it a performance management issue? Is it treated as something which is undermining the performance of the organisation and the business? And if it's treated in that way and taken seriously as a sort of bottom line issue rather than we just need to give them a little bit more training and that will probably sort it, then I think we might see some change. So it has to come back to the organisation to say how we steamrolling this through our organisation to make sure that no one at any level is going to undermine the performance of this organisation in terms of equality and diversity, because we know that undermines our business performance. And I think two bits of attitudinal evidence I wanted to offer you. One is we did this massive survey in January, and we managed to segment out those with recruitment decision-making practice. And of those people, there were 1,400 of them with recruitment decision makers. They were twice as likely to say that they didn't agree with equality of opportunity, that they didn't accept that there should be equality of opportunity. So 16% versus 8% in the wider population. And those people are barriers to progress, and they are in organisations making decisions about employment practice and employment progress every day. And secondly, the other one was, if a woman has a baby, does she become more or less committed to her job? And if a man has a baby, does he become more or less committed to her job? And the population polarises massively on those questions. So a man becomes more committed, so he's got to work harder, he's got a family to support, she's seen as less committed, well, she'll drop out of the labour market, we don't need to worry about her anymore. So these are the kinds of things which really undermine the kind of practice that we see and undermine the kind of legal requirements that are there in place.
Do you want to come in, Nigel?
I was just going to bring in Jessica and Polly on that, because it's all sort of about attitudes underpinning a lot of this, and the fact that perhaps employers sometimes see it as an optional extra or don't take their responsibilities seriously there. I wonder how that sort of reads across into abuse against women, how much of that is driven by specific attitudes against women, and how seriously that's taken by society.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we would take the view, and I think the government does too. It very firmly situates domestic abuse within an agenda of violence against women, and that there is a spectrum of violence and abuse against women that goes from sexist sort of trolling on the internet through to more serious online type offences, stalking, harassment, street harassment, all the way through to domestic abuse. and the 2 women a week that are still being killed in this country on average by a partner or former partner are kind of the top of that big iceberg of violence against women that has its roots absolutely in some of the things Sam was talking about. So rigid conceptions of gender roles that still need to be challenged, and the way in which women are represented very commonly all around us in the media, in advertising and so on, and straightforward sexist attitudes. And I think there's a real opportunity there to build on the government's very clear gendered analysis of that, and the government's promotion of women's rights to live free from abuse and free from fear. What we're seeing increasingly is a bit of an accountability gap, because what you've got is you've got a very strong commitment actually from the centre and from government, but you've also got localism and local decision making. And whatever the human rights instruments are that we've got now, so theoretically we've got the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right not to be enslaved, all of these things happen with domestic abuse. But individuals don't feel that gives them any way of holding anyone to account. So if I could give you a practical example, we've just heard there's a council in the north of England that I can name if asked, but there's a council in the north of England that has decided that it's cutting all its spending on domestic abuse services. So for women in that area, one could well argue that that is a breach of their human rights. They've got nowhere to turn if they're experiencing domestic abuse, even if they're in fear of their life or enslavement or inhuman treatment. Wouldn't it? But all we can do nationally, and the government can do, and I've spoken to DCLG, and DCLG go, this is a really bad thing. I'm not condoning this in any way, but there isn't a remedy. And that woman there doesn't feel the EU gives her any kind of remedy against that. And there's an opportunity here to create something that can break through that accountability gap.
But there are remedies. But what you're saying is those remedies are totally ineffective.
Yes.
Because the first primary remedy would be that council would be breaching its public sector equality duty.
Absolutely.
But what's the consequence?
What's the consequence of that is the issue. And the accountability gap comes with the lack of consequences. So we're just about to see, the Home Office is about to issue, is about to issue a national statement of expectations about what local areas should be providing in terms of domestic abuse services. But the teeth of that, it hasn't got any.
So there aren't any consequences for local authorities who don't fulfil it.
No.
And I think also in terms of abuse and the way in which women as victims react to it, we know that 4 out of 5 victims never call the police, because of many reasons for that. But what we're sort of approaching is a very legalistic way of treating solutions to abuse, rather than statutory services working together to find ways to make that victim safe, whether or not she actually wants to press charges. And we're still very much in that criminal justice mode of looking at women's issues, which requires a woman, to know that what's happening to them is illegal and abuse, and many victims often won't know that what they're in is an abusive relationship until they actually have somebody say, I think, friend or family, or they come in front of a domestic abuse service and actually say this is abuse. So that takes a huge leap though. So there are many women who live with abuse. So on average, just under 3 years is the average length of abuse that women live with. And often society, their friends, their family, actually collude with the perpetrator and saying, well, you just need to do this or do that, rather than actually saying to them, this is abusive and you need to get out of this relationship. So we know fundamentally there has been a shift in terms of attitudes towards women, but I think what was quite worrying about Brexit was that there was a significant proportion of people who voted for Brexit that saw feminism as a force for bad, not a force for good. And I think there is a sort of cultural sort of discussion that is affecting the way in which, particularly when you look at what Polly said, the absolute extent of online misogyny, and that often repeats as offline abuse. So it's not just oh well, people are going online but they never do it in real life. Actually, Polly's research shows that people do carry out threats that they say that they will do to women online. And there have been some very high profile examples of that, particularly with public figures who are women. So while there has been this welcome focus on violence against women from the government and from agencies, and as an organisation we help to pioneer what is called the IDVA MARAC model, so independent domestic violence advisors for those victims at the very highest risk of harm or death. And also at the same time the rollout of MARACs, which are multi-agency risk assessment conferences, so bringing together all the statutory partners to look at a victim's case to try and make sure that she's safe. Actually the funding of that is not sustainable. We only have half the number of IDVAs that we need just to service that proportion of victims at high risk, let alone the rest of the victim population. And from March next year, the Home Office will be withdrawing its funding from MARAC coordinators and people who run these bodies, and also from a fifth of the IDVAs that they fund. So the funding environment can't be ignored. As a sector, it's always been underfunded. So it's not like there's been a high watermark where everything's been a perfect funding system. And we know that the pressures on local government, as probably mentioned, this council in the north, are making it very, very hard to prioritise funding for victims whose rights are being abused every single day.
Jessica, Polly, can I just ask, is there evidence to suggest that violence against women is increasing?
Yes. So violent crime against women is increasing against the trend of overall violent crime, which is decreasing.
And what do we think the causes are for that, above and beyond what you've been talking about already? Why is it increasing in the present?
It may be, when I say it may be an increase in awareness, which I think that, as Jess said, I think unquestionably there is an increase in awareness. So it may be that women are more likely to identify that they've been victims of violence than they were before. But I also think, we do have a culture, and Maria's inquiry on behalf of the Select Committee found, for example, the absolutely routine nature of sexual assault against girls in schools, for example. So I think we do have a culture where, bizarrely, despite the strides being made in A, the recognition of violence against women, and B, the undoubted gains that feminism has made, we still are seeing a culture where women are considered to be fair game in certain environments, and where it still is dangerous to be a woman online, for example. I woke up this morning and I had over 100 very, very not unpleasant mentions in my Twitter mentions just this over one night. And that's fine, it's part of the job, and that's my job. I speak out on behalf of women being abused, but it's the fact that in doing that, that's what I have to expect. And I don't think that is the same for men. In fact, I know it isn't. If you look at The Guardian did a kind of survey of all of its comments underneath its online articles, just to see what was going on there. And of the top 8 writers who received the most abusive and violent comments, 7 were women, and the one that was a man, 9 of them, 7 were women, and the 2 men were black men.
I think it's important to say that if you are a woman who's from an ethnic minority, then you're likely to receive twice as much abuse because of those 2 characteristics.
Absolutely.
We certainly know that in domestic abuse, ethnic minority victims are much less likely to come forward, but also seem to receive a much worse service from statutory services as well.
And when we talk about services being cut, absolutely right, and it's really important to say actually that services for women from particular minority communities are more likely at local level to be cut. And part of the reason for this is that, and part of the issue behind specifically refugees being cut, is local authorities kind of drawing in their resources and only wanting to fund services for women from their own communities. In some cases they don't even want to do that, as I've just said, but a lot of them are putting